For most of your childhood, adults probably asked you what you wanted to be when you grew up. A doctor, a lawyer, a soldier, an athlete. But for millions of children born into slavery in the American South, that question never existed. Their future had already been decided before they could walk, before they could speak, before they could even understand what freedom was. In plantation inventories across the antebellum South, infants appeared beside horses, tools, and livestock, assigned dollar values in neat ink columns by men who had never met them. A healthy child could increase the perceived value of an enslaved mother. Toddlers could be bought, traded, inherited, or sold to settle debts. Entire childhoods reduced to entries in financial records. And somewhere in Georgia, a boy we'll call Doug grew up inside that system. Bare feet pressed into red clay, torn clothes hanging loose from his shoulders, the smell of smoke and dirt in the air before sunrise every morning. Too young to fully understand the machinery surrounding him, but old enough to feel its weight. So what did enslaved children actually do all day? Most people imagine only labor, and there was labor, endless labor. But the full answer is stranger, darker, and far more human than most people expect. Because despite everything, children inside slavery still laughed, still played, still imagined, still found ways to resist a system designed to crush every part of them before adulthood arrived. And in some cases, they learned how to fight back before they even learned how to read. Start with the mornings. Before dawn, plantations were already awake, fires crackling in cooking cabins, wagons creaking through dirt roads, overseers moving across fields while the sky was still dark. Adults were expected to begin labor early, especially during planting and harvest seasons when every hour mattered to the enslavers calculating profits. But the youngest children weren't sent into the fields immediately, not at first. On larger plantations, infants and toddlers were gathered during working hours into crude nurseries, though nursery makes them sound gentler than they actually were. These were often overcrowded cabins where elderly enslaved women, considered too old for field labor, watched groups of children while every able-bodied adult worked elsewhere. The children spent entire days there. Some cried for mothers they rarely saw in daylight. Others sat quietly from exhaustion and hunger. Food was limited, especially for the youngest children. Cornmeal mush, thin scraps of pork when available, leftovers after others had already eaten. Historians estimate enslaved children died at nearly twice the rate of white children in the same regions, with chronic malnutrition being one of the leading causes. For many enslaved children, hunger wasn't occasional, it was constant, a feeling woven into everyday life so deeply that some later described it as one of their earliest memories. And the years without labor disappeared quickly. By 5 or 6 years old, many children were already working. Not pretend chores, real labor, with real consequences if it wasn't completed properly. Carrying water buckets heavy enough to leave their arms shaking, gathering firewood beneath brutal southern heat, cleaning yards, sweeping porches, feeding livestock, chasing birds away from crops, running messages between adults across plantations large enough to take hours to cross on foot. Inside plantation houses, some children performed domestic labor almost invisibly, holding doors, pouring water, standing silently during meals to fan flies away from white families eating dinner. Imagine being 7 years old and already understanding that stillness could be interpreted as laziness, that adults could punish you not because you were dangerous, but because you were momentarily unproductive. Work wasn't treated as something children gradually learned. Work was childhood itself, and the children assigned to domestic labor occupied a particularly unsettling position inside plantation life. They moved constantly through spaces where they did not belong, watching white families live ordinary lives from only a few feet away while remaining trapped entirely outside of them. Enslaved girls between 6 and 12 were often assigned to care for white infants, carrying babies through the same rooms where they themselves could be beaten for small mistakes. Some enslaved children were even given to white children as companions. The language sounds almost harmless today, but these were not friendships. A child could not refuse. A child could not leave. A child remained property, no matter how affection was performed around them. And eventually, most enslaved children entered what plantation records called the trash gangs. That was the real term. Trash gangs. Groups composed of children, elderly people, pregnant women, and injured workers. anyone considered not yet productive enough, or no longer productive enough, for full labor in the fields. Doug, somewhere around 8 or 9 years old, likely would have spent his days there, pulling weeds from endless crop rows beneath the sun, collecting cotton missed by adult pickers, carrying tools and supplies across fields larger than modern neighborhoods, moving brush, digging trenches, performing the exhausting background labor that kept plantations functioning. And here's what matters most. The labor wasn't easier because they were children. It was simply the maximum their bodies could survive while still remaining economically useful. Then came the transition every enslaved child understood was approaching: the fields. For many children, this began somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. That was the moment childhood effectively ended. Full field labor varied depending on the crop. Cotton plantations demanded relentless speed. Children bent low for hours pulling fibers from sharp plants that cut their fingers raw. Overseers tracked weight totals carefully, and quotas rarely became smaller, simply because someone was young. Tobacco required delicate, constant attention. Hands became stained and cracked from handling leaves all day in humid heat. Rice plantations exposed workers to insects and disease in flooded wetlands. And sugar plantations were considered among the most brutal labor systems in the Americas. During harvest seasons, enslaved workers sometimes labored nearly without stopping, while grinding mills and boiling rooms operated through the night. Frederick Douglass later described realizing as a child that slavery was not temporary, that adulthood would not suddenly bring freedom or mercy. Children like Doug would have reached that same realization slowly. Then, all at once, the moment where you stop imagining escape and begin understanding permanence. But here's the part many people never hear about. Between the labor, something unexpected survived: childhood itself. Again and again, formerly enslaved people interviewed decades later described moments of play hidden between work assignments and exhaustion, racing through dirt paths between cabins after sunset, wrestling with siblings, chasing each other through open yards while adults cooked evening meals nearby. Children made dolls from scraps of cloth and carved toys from wood when they could find it. Some hardened clay into makeshift marbles. Others rode branches like horses through the dirt. For brief moments, they became ordinary children again. And one game appears so often across slave narratives that historians took special notice of it. It was called Hide the Switch. One child would cut a small branch from a tree and hide it nearby. Whoever found it earned the right to chase the others and strike them with it. To modern ears, that sounds horrifying, because it was. But psychologists studying childhood trauma noticed something important about games like these. Children often recreate frightening systems inside play because it gives them partial control over situations where they normally have none. The game transformed punishment into something temporarily manageable, something predictable, something survivable. It wasn't simply entertainment, it was adaptation, a child's attempt to process violence inside a world where violence shaped nearly every part of life. And some children found another form of resistance entirely: education. Across much of the South, teaching enslaved people to read or write was illegal. Laws were passed specifically to prevent literacy from spreading among enslaved communities because slaveholders understood something dangerous about education. A person who could read could also forge documents. A person who could write could communicate secretly. A person who understood maps, newspapers, or travel passes became harder to control. And despite the risks, underground schools appeared anyway. Sometimes lessons happened in kitchens after dark. Sometimes in hidden rooms behind free black churches. Children arrived separately, so groups wouldn't attract attention. Books were wrapped in cloth or paper so passing strangers couldn't identify them. Lessons happened in whispers. Students left one at a time. Susie King Taylor later described attending one of these secret schools in Savannah when she was only 7 years old. Think about how dangerous that was. Children risking severe punishment for the chance to learn the alphabet, not because education was symbolic, because literacy could become survival. A forged pass could allow movement after curfew. A written note could organize escape. Words themselves became dangerous objects. And then there was religion, because nighttime on plantations often held two entirely separate worlds. The version enslavers encouraged centered around obedience. White-controlled church services emphasized passages instructing servants to obey masters. Christianity was presented as justification for hierarchy and submission. But away from plantation oversight, enslaved communities created something entirely different. Late at night, families gathered quietly in forests, hidden clearings, and brush arbors far from white supervision. Adults whispered prayers while children listened beside them in darkness, broken only by firelight. And inside those gatherings, biblical stories changed meaning completely. Moses confronting Pharaoh, captives escaping bondage, the oppressed surviving impossible systems. For enslaved children, these stories carried enormous emotional power. Many encountered the first real possibility of freedom, not through politics, but through religion, through the idea that slavery was not permanent, that suffering could end, that another world might exist somewhere beyond the plantation boundary. Those nighttime gatherings built inner lives that enslavers could never fully control. And maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all, because slavery depended not only on physical labor, but on psychological domination. It required convincing human beings that resistance was hopeless and freedom unimaginable. But imagination survived anyway. What Doug's exact days looked like depended on countless factors: his age, the plantation size, the crop being grown, the personality of the enslaver claiming ownership over him. Some enslaved children described moments of relative looseness after work hours. Others described constant surveillance and punishment for the smallest mistakes. Some plantations allowed small gardens. Others barely allowed rest. But nearly every surviving account points toward the same underlying truth. Childhood under slavery was a countdown toward becoming fully profitable. Everyone understood it. The enslavers were waiting for it. The children felt it approaching long before adulthood arrived, and somehow, inside that narrowing space between birth and labor, many still managed to create games, friendships, stories, songs, secret schools, religious gatherings, and fragments of joy fragile enough to disappear almost instantly, but powerful enough to survive in memory generations later. And maybe that's the strangest part of all, that even inside a system specifically designed to reduce human beings into property, children still kept finding ways to act like children, right up until the world forced them not to.